He said he'd only stay for one night, then he never left. Before we dive into the story, tell me where in the world you're watching from, and if this story steals your heart, please hit subscribe. The knock came just after 10, a hard, desperate sound against the old wood of the door, barely audible over the gale whipping rain against the window panes. Lily Myers froze, paintbrush hovering over the swirl of indigo she was working into a stormy seascape. No one ever knocked on her door. That was the entire point of the place. A clapboard cottage at the end of a forgotten dirt lane, with only the belligerent gulls and the sighing of the Atlantic for company. She had curated her isolation with the precision of a jeweler, cutting away every facet of her old life until only this quiet, lonely piece remained. The knock came again, stronger this time, a fist against the blueberry blue paint she'd so carefully applied last spring. It was the sound of the outside world, the one she had fled, demanding entry. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of her own making. For a terrifying second, she thought it was him, that somehow Julian had found her. But Julian's knock would have been different, arrogant, proprietary, the rap of knuckles that expected the door to swing open without question. This was something else. This was urgent. Taking a deep, unsteadying breath, she placed the brush down, wiped her paint-stained hands on her leggings, and crept toward the door. She peered through the small, salt-fuzzed pane of glass beside it. A man stood on her porch, a large, dark shape half obscured by the deluge. He was hunched against the wind, one hand pressed to his side, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. He wasn't Julian. Relief warred with a fresh spike of apprehension. She undid the bolt, her knuckles white, and opened the door a crack, the safety chain pulled taut. The wind tore at the opening, trying to rip it from her grasp, bringing with it the cold, wet scent of the storm and of him. He looked up, and in the dim glow of the porch light, she saw his face. He was younger than she'd first thought, maybe early 30s, with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble and eyes that seemed to absorb the meager light. There was a cut on his temple, a thin line of red stark against his sun-touched complexion. He looked exhausted, and more than that, he looked pained. "My truck broke down," he said, his voice a low rumble that was almost lost to the storm. "Just up the road. My phone's dead. I was wondering if I could use yours." He gestured vaguely back into the blackness, but his gaze was fixed on her, a quiet, steady inspection that felt unnervingly perceptive. He didn't look like a threat, not in the overt, swaggering way she was used to. He looked like a man at the end of his rope. She saw the worn denim of his jacket, soaked through, and the faint tremor in his hands, Carpenter's hands, she noted, calloused and capable. Lily's carefully constructed walls, the ones built from fear and betrayal, wavered. She saw not a stranger, but a reflection of her own desperation on the day she'd arrived here, broken down in a different way. "The storm's knocked out the line," she heard herself say, the words feeling foreign in her own mouth. "It happens all the time." Disappointment flickered across his face, so profound it was almost startling. He seemed to shrink a little, the broad shoulders slumping. He nodded, as if accepting one more defeat in a long line of them. "Right, of course. Sorry to have bothered you." He started to turn away, back into the roaring dark. A gust of wind slammed a sheet of rain against him, and he flinched, his hand tightening at his side. It was an involuntary, animal sound of pain that slipped past his lips, and it was that sound that made her decision. "Wait," she called out, her voice thin against the gale. "You can't go back out in this, you're hurt." He stopped but didn't turn around. "I'm fine." The lie was as plain as the cut on his head. "No, you're not," she insisted, unlatching the chain. The metallic clink sounded like a gunshot in the quiet house. "Come in, you can wait out the storm, just for one night. The couch is yours." He finally turned, his expression unreadable. For a long moment he just stood there, letting the rain plaster his clothes to his skin, his quiet, steady gaze searching her face for something she couldn't name. He seemed to be weighing a choice far more significant than simply accepting shelter. Then, with a slow, deliberate nod, he stepped across her threshold, bringing the storm and the scent of the cold, wild sea into her small, safe world. He said his name was Evan. It was the first of his lies. He never spoke of the truck again. In the morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a sky washed clean and a world dripping and glistening in the new sun. The phone line was still dead. He was quiet, moving with a stiff grace that betrayed a deeper pain than he would admit. She, given him a dry sweatshirt and a pair of her father's old sweatpants, and the sight of him in her small kitchen, broad-shouldered and solid, dwarfing her chipped mugs and string lights, was both unsettling and strangely comforting. She made coffee, and he drank it black, his hands wrapped around the warm ceramic as if it were a lifeline. She noticed then that the knuckles on his right hand were scraped raw, the skin split and bruised. It was not the injury of a man whose truck had simply broken down. She didn't ask. Asking questions was a currency she no longer dealt in. Questions led to answers, and answers led to attachments. She had come here to be untethered, but he didn't leave. He offered to look at the leaky roof patch that had been mocking her for months, and with a quiet competence, he shimmied up the ladder she kept in the shed and fixed it. He chopped the pile of firewood that had been slowly succumbing to damp, stacking it neatly on the porch. He moved through her space with a silent purpose, his presence a low hum of energy in a house that had been silent for too long. His name was Evan. It was Alessandro Volkov, the head of the Volkov Bratva. The truck hadn't broken down. It was currently at the bottom of a ravine miles away, a smoldering wreck of metal and fire. He had been driving back from a meeting, a supposed truce negotiation with the Falcone family, when his own man, his second-in-command, Dmitri, had sold him out. The ambush had been swift and brutal. Alessandro had escaped, but not unscathed. A bullet had grazed his ribs, and the crash had left him bruised and disoriented. He had stumbled through the woods for hours, the storm covering his tracks, until he saw the single, warm light of her cottage, a beacon in the hostile darkness. Knocking on that door was the most desperate gamble of his life. He'd expected a suspicious old man or a frightened family. He hadn't expected her. Lily. With her soft porcelain skin, a dusting of old paint on her cheek, and gentle eyes that held a deep, familiar sorrow. Her small act of kindness, letting a wounded stranger into her home, was a purity he hadn't encountered in years. It was a weakness. It was a balm. And as the days bled into one another, he found himself clinging to it, to her, with a desperation that unnerved him. He told himself it was strategic. He was recovering, letting the heat die down, waiting to see how the fallout from Dimitri's betrayal would settle. He couldn't risk using a phone, couldn't risk contacting his loyal men and leading the Falcones to this place, to her. This was a temporary sanctuary. But the lie felt thinner with every passing day, with every shared meal over her worn kitchen table, with every evening spent in comfortable silence as she painted, and he watched the fire, the quiet, ordinary magic of it all seeping into the cracks of his heavily armored soul. One afternoon, a week after he arrived, she was sketching by the window, the charcoal whispering across the paper. He was mending a broken slat in the fence that bordered her property, the rhythmic tap of his hammer a steady heartbeat in the salty air. Mr. Henderson from the neighboring property, a nosy, sour-faced man who disapproved of Lily's solitude, ambled over. He peered at Alessandro with open suspicion. "You still here?" he asked, his tone accusatory. "Thought you were just passing through." "Helping Lily out with a few things," Alessandro replied, his voice even, his eyes never leaving his work. "She's got a lot on her plate for one person," Henderson pressed, his gaze flicking to Lily in the window. "A pretty young thing like her all alone out here, it's not right, attracts the wrong kind of attention." The hammer went still in Alessandro's hand. He straightened up slowly, turning to face the older man. He didn't say a word, he simply looked at him. His gaze was flat, devoid of emotion, yet it held a weight that seemed to suck the very air from around them. It was a look that stripped away the folksy carpenter and revealed something ancient and predatory beneath. Henderson, who had puffed out his chest to deliver his unsolicited opinion, seemed to shrink. The color drained from his face. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing in his wrinkled throat. "Well," he stammered, taking a step back. Just making an observation." He turned and scurried away without another word. Alessandro watched him go before turning his attention back to the fence, the hammer resuming its steady, rhythmic beat. Inside, Lily lowered her sketchbook, her own heart beating in time with the hammer. She had seen the exchange, had felt the sudden, chilling shift in the atmosphere. She didn't know what Evan had done, what silent threat had passed between the two men, but she knew one thing for certain. The quiet carpenter fixing her fence was capable of a stillness more terrifying than any storm. And for the first time in a very long time, as she looked at his broad back, she felt a dizzying, dangerous sense of being protected. The temptation to lean into that feeling, to let his strength be her shield, was a siren song she was afraid she was no longer strong enough to resist. The bubble of their strange, domestic peace was bound to burst. It happened on a crisp autumn Saturday. Lily had driven into the small coastal town for supplies, a rare trip she undertook with methodical speed, keeping her head down and her interactions brief. Alessandro had insisted on coming with her, a silent shadow at her side whose presence made the air around her feel both charged and secure. He had called it a need for fresh air, but she knew it was something else. He watched everything, his quiet gaze missing no detail. The man who lingered too long near the produce, the car that passed them twice on the main street. He was a sentinel, and she was, for some unspoken reason, the person he was guarding. They were walking back to her old pickup truck, the bed filled with groceries and a new pot of blueberry blue paint, when a sleek black sedan pulled up beside them. The tinted window slid down, and Lily's blood ran cold. It was Julian Croft. He looked exactly the same, impeccably dressed in a cashmere sweater, his blonde hair perfectly coiffed, a smile on his face that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. That smile had once charmed her. Now it was the stuff of her nightmares. "Lily, darling," he said, his voice a smooth, venomous caress. "I have to admit I'm impressed. A literal cottage at the end of the world, it's all very rustic." He ignored Alessandro completely, his focus entirely on her, pinning her with his gaze. "This little game of yours is over. Get in the car." Lily felt the familiar, paralyzing fear seize her, her throat tightening, her hands starting to shake. She had spent a year building a life where she would never have to hear that tone again, that calm, reasonable command that promised violence if it was disobeyed. But before she could even find her voice, a hand settled on the small of her back. Alessandro's hand. It was warm and steady, a grounding force against the panic. He stepped forward slightly, placing himself between her and the car. He still looked like Evan the carpenter, dressed in a faded flannel shirt and worn jeans, but the man who faced Julian was not a simple handyman. "She's not going anywhere with you," Alessandro said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, yet it cut through the air with the sharp finality of a blade. Julian's smile tightened. He finally deigned to look at Alessandro, his eyes sweeping over him in a dismissive once-over. "And who is this? Your local lumberjack. Lily, you can do so much better." "Now stop this nonsense." He started to open his car door. Alessandro took one step closer, leaning down slightly toward the open window. Lily couldn't hear what he said. His voice was too low, his words meant for Julian alone. But she saw the effect they had. The color drained from Julian's face, his confident smirk dissolving into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock, which quickly morphed into terror. His hand, which had been on the door handle, snapped back as if burned. He stared at Alessandro, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly agape. Whatever Alessandro had said, it was more than a threat. It was a promise, a detailed and gruesome blueprint of a future Julian now saw laid out before him. Without another word, Julian's hand fumbled for the button on the door panel. The window slid up, sealing him inside his car. The engine revved, and the sedan peeled away from the curb with a squeal of tires, leaving only the scent of exhaust and Lily's pounding heart in its wake. The street was quiet again. Alessandro turned back to her, his expression unreadable, but the chilling intensity lingered in his eyes. "Let's go home," he said softly. The walk back to the truck was silent. When they were finally back in the sanctuary of her cottage, the groceries unpacked, the blue paint sitting on the counter like a silent promise of normalcy, she finally found her voice. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. He didn't answer right away. He walked over to the sink, turned on the tap, and splashed cold water on his face. He braced his hands on the counter, his broad back to her. "My name is Alessandro," he said, his voice muffled. He turned to face her, wiping his face with a dish towel. He pulled up the side of his sweatshirt, the one she had given him. Taped just below his ribs was a thick, blood-stained bandage. He carefully peeled back a corner, revealing the angry, puckered edges of a gunshot wound. "There was no truck accident," he said, his voice flat. "I was ambushed, left for dead." He told her not everything, but enough. He told her his name was Alessandro Volkov, and that he ran a security and logistics empire. A family business. He painted a picture of immense wealth and power, but also of constant danger and hidden enemies. He told her about Dimitri, the man he had trusted like a brother, who had set him up to be killed by his rivals, the Falcone family, for a bigger piece of the territory. The story was vague in its particulars but stark in its implications. He was a man who lived in a world of violence and betrayal, a world from which he had needed to vanish. He showed her the other scars then. A silvery, jagged line that ran along his forearm, a puckered circle on his shoulder, each one a memento from the life he was hiding from. "Julian Croft is a bully," Alessandro said, his gaze intense. "He uses his money and connections to hurt people he sees as weaker. My world is different. The men I deal with don't make threats. They erase problems. I told him that if he ever came near you again, if he even spoke your name to another living soul, I would erase him and everyone he has ever loved from the face of the earth. And he knew, looking at me, that I could do it." Lily stared at him, at the man who had fixed her fence and slept on her couch, who listened to her playlists and made her feel safe. That man was still there, but now she saw the rest of him, the ruthless power, the capacity for chilling violence, the dark kingdom he commanded. He was not a savior. He was something far more dangerous. And as she looked into his tired, honest eyes, she realized with a terrifying certainty that she was already falling in love with him. The confession that followed Julian's departure was not one of words, but of actions. The partial truth he had offered hung in the air between them, a dangerous, magnetic field that pulled them inexorably closer. The pretense of Evan the carpenter was gone, and in its place was Alessandro Volkov, a man of shadows and secrets who had chosen her small, light-filled cottage as his sanctuary. The knowledge should have sent her running. Instead, it bound her to him. That night, she found him standing on the porch, staring out at the dark, placid ocean. The rage from the confrontation with Julian had faded, leaving behind a profound weariness that seemed to settle deep in his bones. She came to stand beside him, not touching, but close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. The silence stretched, filled only by the gentle shushing of the waves on the shore. He was the one who broke it, his voice low and rough. "You should be afraid of me, Lily." She hugged her arms around herself, the night air cool on her skin. "I am," she admitted, her own voice barely a whisper. "But not in the way I was of him. With Julian, the fear was of what he would do to me. With you, I'm afraid of what you make me feel." He turned then, his body angling toward hers in the dim light from the kitchen window. His gaze was intense, searching her face as if trying to decipher a language he'd long forgotten. "And what is that?" he asked, his voice laced with a raw vulnerability she had never heard from him before. "Safe," she breathed, the word a truth so potent it stole the air from her lungs. "You make me feel safe, and it's been so long since I've felt that I'm not sure I know what to do with it." That was all it took. He closed the small distance between them, one hand coming up to gently cup her jaw, his thumbs stroking her cheek. His touch was hesitant, almost reverent, the calloused skin of his palm a stark contrast to the softness of her own. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. And then he kissed her. It was not a kiss of gentle romance. It was a kiss of desperation, of a drowning man finding air. It was a fusion of the two worlds they inhabited, her quiet longing and his fierce, pent-up hunger. It tasted of salt and secrets, of loneliness and a desperate, shared need for connection. The kiss deepened, moving from the porch into the house, a trail of discarded layers of protection and denial left in their wake. They came together not in a flurry of passion, but with a slow, deliberate intensity, an act of mutual solace that was both a surrender and a reclamation. In the quiet of her bedroom, with the moonlight painting silver stripes across the floor, he showed her a tenderness she never would have believed the man who terrified Julian Croft was capable of. And she, in turn, offered him a peace his violent world could never provide. In the days that followed, the cottage transformed from a hideout into a home. They fell into a rhythm that felt both brand new and deeply familiar. He would wake before her, the scent of coffee his silent greeting. They would work on the house together, their hands often brushing, each touch a spark of electricity. He offered her a promise, not in flowery words, but in solid, irrefutable actions. "No one will ever hurt you again," he said to her one evening, as they sat by the fire, her head resting on his shoulder. "I'll burn the world down before I let anyone lay a hand on you." He spoke of a future she could barely imagine, one of complete security, where her financial worries would vanish, where she could paint without the shadow of her past looming over her. He would build a fortress around her, using his power and wealth as the mortar and stone. But the walls of a fortress, she knew, could just as easily become the walls of a gilded cage. The price of his protection became clear a few days later. They were driving back from a walk on the beach, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and violet. Alessandro was driving her old truck, his hand resting on her knee, a simple, possessive gesture that sent a thrill through her. He stiffened suddenly, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. "We have a tail," he said, his voice dropping into that chillingly calm tone she was coming to recognize. A black sedan, much like Julian's but more generic, had been behind them for the last 3 miles. Lily's heart began to pound. Alessandro made a series of sharp, unpredictable turns down side roads, but the car stayed with them, maintaining a steady distance. It wasn't a pursuit, it was a message. "We know where you are. We are watching." He lost them eventually, his driving skills far exceeding what a simple carpenter should possess. But the sense of violation lingered long after they were back behind the blueberry blue door. The sanctuary had been breached. Later that night, as she was getting ready for bed, she heard a soft thud on the porch. Alessandro was beside her in an instant, pushing her behind him, his body a solid shield. He moved to the window, peering cautiously through the curtains. After a long moment, he relaxed his stance, but the tension didn't leave his shoulders. He opened the door and retrieved what had been thrown. It was a dead crow, its black feathers stark against the weathered wood of the porch. Tied to its leg with a red ribbon was a small, ornate silver cross, the symbol of the Falcone family. The message was unmistakable, a warning, an omen. "This is my world, Lily," Alessandro said, his back to her as he stared at the grim offering in his hand. "This ugliness. This is the price of being with me. They know I'm here, and now they know about you. You are a target because of me." He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a torment that tore at her heart. "I can protect you. I will. But it means leaving this life behind. It means living inside the walls I build for you. Your peace, your quiet, it will be gone. Is that a price you are willing to pay?" She looked at him, at the powerful, dangerous man who had shown her such profound tenderness. She thought of the life she had here, the quiet solitude she had mistaken for peace. It wasn't peace, it was hiding. With him there was danger, but there was also life, passion, and a love so fierce it felt like it could hold the entire world at bay. Her choice was not between safety and danger. It was between being alone and being with him. "You said you'd only stay for one night," she said softly, walking toward him, her gaze unwavering. "And then you never left. You fixed my roof. You fixed my fence. You fixed my heart. My life was already gone, Alessandro. You're the one who gave it back to me, so yes, the price is worth it." The final reckoning came sooner than either of them expected. The catalyst was not the Falcones' patient surveillance, but Julian Croft's wounded pride. Humiliated and enraged by the quiet, terrifying threat from a man he dismissed as a common laborer, Julian had used his considerable resources to dig into the stranger who had stolen Lily from him. It didn't take long for his investigators to connect the dots. Whispers of a war in the underworld, the disappearance of the head of the Volkov organization, and the sudden power vacuum Dmitri was trying to fill. Realizing he had stumbled upon a weapon, Julian made a call. He offered the Falcones a gift, the precise location of Alessandro Volkov, confirming he was alive and vulnerable, with only one woman for protection. In exchange, he wanted Lily back, though what he would get was far from what he imagined. The attack came just after dawn. Lily had awoken in Alessandro's arms, the morning light soft and gray through the window. For a moment, everything was perfect. Then came the sound, a low crunch of tires on the gravel of her long driveway, too many to be a single vehicle. Alessandro was out of the bed in an instant, his body a fluid motion of tightly coiled muscle. He was already pulling on his jeans, his face a mask of cold, lethal focus. "Get in the bathroom," he ordered, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Lock the door and stay in the tub. Do not come out no matter what you hear." He pulled a sleek black handgun from a duffel bag under the bed, the sight of it both alien and terrifying in her cozy bedroom. He checked the clip with an practiced efficiency that spoke of a lifetime of familiarity. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her, but she nodded, her body moving on instinct. She scrambled into the small bathroom, locking the door and huddling in the cold, empty bathtub, pulling the shower curtain closed. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it would break. The idyllic cottage, their safe haven, was about to become a war zone. She heard the first sounds of splintering wood as the front door was kicked in, followed by shouting in a language she didn't understand. Then, the sharp, deafening crack of gunfire erupted, shockingly loud in the small house. It was followed by another, and another. A a symphony of violence. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her hands over her ears, trying to block out the sounds of the brutal reality she had chosen. She could hear Alessandro moving through the house, the distinct, controlled bursts from his weapon a counterpoint to the more chaotic spray of his attackers. Glass shattered. A man screamed, a horrible, gurgling sound that was cut off abruptly. Through it all, she could feel the vibration of heavy bodies falling, the house groaning under the weight of the battle it contained. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The cacophony of the fight seemed to move from the living room to the kitchen, then faded as it spilled outside. The gunfire became more sporadic, distant. Then, a profound, ringing silence fell over the house, broken only by the frantic chirping of birds outside and the ragged sound of her own breathing. She waited, huddled in the tub, every muscle tensed, unsure if the silence meant safety or something far worse. After what felt like a lifetime, she heard a soft knock on the bathroom door. "Lily," Alessandro's voice came, strained and rough. "It's over. You can come out." She shakily unlocked the door and pushed it open. He stood there, his face smeared with dirt and something darker, a cut bleeding freely above his eyebrow. His knuckles were raw, his shirt torn, but he was alive. He was standing. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, his body trembling with the adrenaline of the fight. "Are you hurt?" he murmured into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. She shook her head against his chest, clinging to him. Over his shoulder, she saw the devastation. Her living room was destroyed. Furniture was overturned, her paintings were slashed, and bullet holes riddled the walls. And on the floor near the entryway lay two men in dark suits, their bodies still, their lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling. Outside, more men, Alessandro's men, were silently and efficiently cleaning up the aftermath, dragging bodies away, their faces grim and professional. They had been here all along, she realized, hidden in the woods, watching, waiting for his signal. This was his fortress. He gently pushed her back, holding her at arm's length, his gaze searching her face. He saw the horror in her eyes as she took in the carnage he had brought to her doorstep. The full, bloody, undeniable truth of his life was laid bare in the wreckage of her home. "This is who I am, Lily," he said, his voice raw. "This violence will always be a part of my life. I gave you a choice once. I am giving it to you again. My men will take you anywhere you want to go. They will set you up with a new life, a new name. No one will ever find you. You can be safe. You can be free of this." He was offering her an escape, an out. He was offering to let her go, even though she could see in his eyes that it would shatter him. She looked from the destruction around her to the man standing before her, the man who had mended her roof and soothed her fears, the ruthless killer who had just protected her with a terrifying ferocity, the wounded soul who was willing to lose the only good thing in his life to keep her safe. She saw it all, and she was not afraid. She reached up and gently touched the cut on his forehead, her fingers coming away with his blood. "You said you'd stay for one night," she whispered, her voice clear and strong in the quiet devastation. "And I'm holding you to it, every night. This is my home, Alessandro, and you are my home. I'm not going anywhere." A wave of relief so profound it was almost painful washed over his face, erasing the years of conflict and loneliness from his features. He pulled her back against him, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was not about passion, but about promise. It was a seal, a vow made amidst the wreckage, a foundation for a future they would build together. They would rebuild the house, paint the door a fresh coat of blueberry blue, and chase away the ghosts with a love that had been tested by fire and had not only survived, but had been forged into something unbreakable. His empire would remain, a dark and distant thing, but its heart would now be here in a small cottage by the sea, a fortress built not of stone, but of a quiet, extraordinary love.